With the release of the new FNAF game, I decided for the first time in a very long time to see how that side of gaming had been going. As I was looking up the newer titles that had come out throughout the years that I hadn't seen yet, I came across this subgenre of horror games for kids that tried to replicate the success of the FNAF franchise in their own way, with one very specific game catching my eye for its rather interesting development and shady behind the scenes practices. I soon became enamored with this idea of horror games for kids and the market that's built around it, and so I decided to piece everything together from the very beginning all the way up until now, and I soon started to see a growing problem in this market that only happened recently, but a problem nonetheless. Of course, to understand the horror games for kids market, we must start at the very beginning, and where's a better place to begin than with the horror game concept itself? Horror games have been around for decades now, with Resident Evil being the game that brought it to the mainstream, albeit in its own subgenre it popularized, survival horror. Resident Evil in recent years has strayed away from the horror part of their games, but Capcom still has what it takes to make both a horror and action-focused version of their franchise if they feel like it. Of course, with the explosion of Resident Evil, you had other game titles coming out, with companies trying to dip their toes into the horror gaming genre throughout the 2000s, with varying success, some being all-time greats, some not so great, and some becoming a shell of their former selves. By the time the 2010s rolled about, the horror or even survival horror aspect of horror games was slowly being stripped away in favor of more action-oriented games, as was the rage during the 7th console generation. The aforementioned Dead Space series is a prime example of this. Dead Space came out in 2008 and was absolutely terrifying to play. It nailed everything about horror and survival horror games and ramped things up to 11. Dead Space 2 came out in 2011 and was a great sequel with many more action set pieces thrown about, and while the game wasn't as scary as the first in my opinion, it was more than enough for gamers to get their survival horror and action fix all in one tightly made package. Then came Dead Space 3, released in 2013, a game that, while it was a fine play through and through, clearly wasn't like the earlier titles and felt more like a third-person shooter with horror pieces thrown about. The series got lost in the sauce, so to speak, through EA's meddling, though the new remake is looking like it's headed back to its roots and is rather promising, so we'll see how that does whenever it comes out. There was a game released between Dead Space 2 and 3, however, a game that for all intents and purposes kinda just came out of nowhere. A game that was the very beginning of this horror games for kids concept. A game that some people today might not even remember, considering it's been 10 whole years since it graced everyone's YouTube recommendations. That game, my friends, is Slender. Yeah, it's been 10 years since Slender came out. I know, I remember watching PewDiePie play this game on the family laptop way back when I was a kid. This game was a horror game unlike any other at the time. Horror games are leaning in a direction of survival horror with action and spooky jump scares and grotesque imagery, but let's face it, you can only see the same necromorph 20 times over and over again before it starts to get a bit stale for players to deal with. Not to mention, you can kill these enemies and move forward, knowing well you don't have to worry about getting attacked or scared by one of them anymore with the threat neutralized. The game was different for its time not only because of the simple premise, but because of the smaller details too. Your goal is to collect 8 pages and that's it. Have fun roaming around and completing your task. The game world you play in isn't the biggest nor has the most detailed environments, but what made it so compelling was the small details that wrapped everything together. The game is pitch black, with the only thing being the limited battery flashlight to keep the players knowing what direction they're going in. The sound effects are simple, with the crunching grass, crickets chirping, and the players breathing being the only things you hear in the game. There is no theme music, no background humming or anything of that sort, until you start picking up the pages. The more you pick up, the more the eerie music builds, adding a major sense of dread for anybody playing, as well, there's only one reason for the music to build up in the first place. The closer you get to your goal, the more tense the game becomes. The music builds up, the flashlight starts to run out, and now, the Slender Man is chasing you down. Anytime you see him, the game would play a loud piano slam and the screen would start to static up, meaning you gotta run before he gets you. If you're too late, it's game over, as the screen completely fills with static with his face right up in your own, all while playing a loud, deafening, ear-piercing screeching sound. Older versions of the game would kick you right to your desktop, adding a deeper sense of failure and spookiness, though this was changed in an update for those wanting to start again in a normal fashion. Slender was an immediate hit from the very day it launched, because it was a game that no one had seen or played before on such a massive scale up to that point. Sure, there were games that focused on the defenselessness of the player and running from your aggressors rather than fighting them, but none reached the popularity that Slender did at the time, or nearly as quickly. The game itself was not only simple simple to pick up and play, but was also free, meaning anybody could play it and it could even run on the worst of computers and laptops. These are all major factors that helped it grow in popularity, but there was one underlying thing that was brought to the table that helped it gain such massive traction that not a lot of people think about: the emergence of Let's Players. The concept of Let's Players being integral to a game's success was something that most people didn't expect to happen, but those that were active enough on YouTube knew at the very least that Let's Players were important when it came to showing off a new game to the public. I can remember watching walkthroughs and Let's Plays of many games as a kid. Ironically enough, Dead Space 2 being one of the very first games I watched from beginning to end on the Rad Brad's YouTube channel way back in 2011. PewDiePie had already been playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent a few months before Slender dropped, and it's safe to say the boost in attention from his videos on it were more than enough to bring in extra buyers and attention towards that game. Amnesia was one of the first instances of a Let's Player bringing more attention towards a game, but Slender was the first instance of the sheer power and influence Let's Players could have when it came to the viral success of any video game they play. You had a multitude of popular figures playing Slender, like the aforementioned PewDiePie, and even the early days of Markiplier gave it a go himself, which is none too surprising given a similar endeavor years later would prove vital to his channel's massive success. I remember seeing people talk about Slender in the comments on Call of Duty videos, music videos, even on my old Facebook profile I would see people talking about the game. I remember playing the game at my friend's house on his really janky laptop running at like 12 frames a second at 2 in the morning, scaring the piss out of each other, and reading the comments of the PewDiePie video itself to see how others reacted. Slender was a viral success, and part of that success can certainly be attributed to the Let's Players doing what they do best: playing a video game that they enjoy and showing other people their insane reactions. Now of course, after the attention Slender got, a new game would come out months later: Slender: The Arrival, a fully produced version of the original. While it's entertaining in its own regard and had some pleasant changes like better graphics and more production quality overall, the new title was overshadowed ironically by a bunch of Slender copycat games. Some of these games expanded upon the Slender idea by using different characters and locations while still keeping the same gameplay loop of collecting pages, but it quickly turned into a cheap cash grab for people trying to piggyback off the success of the original, eventually getting pinned with the term walking simulator to refer to these games. I remember coming across a lot of these on YouTube and around the internet, and I felt like the various iterations of game inspired by Slender was more of a way to deflect the blatant lack of inspiration these games had. You can only walk through different locations with the same goal in mind so many times before it becomes really old and boring. During late 2012 to mid 2014, the walking simulator genre was mainly just Slender copycat games, with Diamonds in the Rough popping its head around the corner every couple months or so. It grew increasingly boring to watch these Let's Players play what is essentially the same exact thing as Slender, only with a slightly new paint job or better graphics. Some games managed to use this genre to create fantastic settings with great stories, while other games were clearly banking on the ease of making a walking simulator to begin with. Not to diss the developers of these games or anything, but it was becoming clear that the walking simulator genre had a shorter life than expected, and even though they were fully functioning games that had little to no bugs, it was clear that a breath of fresh air and some innovation was needed to keep that flashlight from fading out for the last time. Now there is one thing I hadn't mentioned yet that helped this game grow beyond just being a game: the popularity of creepypasta stories during the early 2010s. If you don't know what a creepypasta is, it's basically a really bad story involving a made-up killer or paranormal entity or whatever the hell the writer desires. Jeff the Killer is a popular creepypasta that comes to mind. The audience that loved reading these were around the 11 to 15 year age gap, about the age where kids start being really edgy on their Tumblr pages as they get ready to go to high school, and Slender was a figure that blew up majorly in the creepypasta fandom. Story after story after story was made of him. Fan art was everywhere whenever you looked him up, and some kids even went crazy and decided to enact their own form of violence on someone in the name of Slenderman at one point. However, one thing was for certain: this video game, a game that has no blood, gore, violence, a game that is built purely off tension with a memorable character, a character that has made its way outside of just gaming and internet folklore and into the mainstream, this was the very first example of the horror games for kids concept being introduced to people, as the roughly stitched together formula will be built upon a few years later into a much more successful franchise. On August 8th, 2014, a little indie game was released called Five Nights at Freddy's. The game was created by a man named Scott Cawthon after his last game, Chipper Sons and Lumber Co. was criticized for looking creepy, unsettling, and generally just off-putting overall. Instead of giving up on his dream of video game creation, he decided to use that criticism as inspiration for his next game, and decided to tap into the horror gaming genre as the perfect catalyst for what he had in store. To say this was a smart idea is a vast understatement, as 8 years later the game has been turned into a multimedia franchise that is still going very strong, seeing all-time highs on the Google search results, which is frankly just astonishing to me. Now, the game itself was something that nobody had seen at the time. It took the walking simulator genre and threw that straight out the window. Now, instead of being able to walk and run away from your tormentors, you straight up couldn't even move anymore and were confined to a cramped, disorganized, and downright disheveled office room. The premise was simple as well. You're a security guard and your job is to survive from 12 AM to 6 AM for 5 nights, hence the name Five Nights at Freddy's, all while trying to keep the 4 animatronics out of the office room. We'll get into those animatronics soon enough, but first let's go over the gameplay real quick. The gameplay is the bread and butter of the entire experience. You have security cameras you use to keep tabs on the 4 animatronics, with the feeds being grainy and poorly lit, adding more of a creepiness factor to the entire overall experience. You have 2 doors you can close whenever the animatronics move right outside your security room, and you can close them to keep yourself protected from them. However, don't keep the doors closed for too long, otherwise they'll run out of power, and the whole game will go pitch black as the titular Freddy Fazbear himself shows up and jump scares you, ending your run. It's a very simple yet engaging gameplay loop, and the main thing holding it all together is the atmosphere and those 4 damn animatronics. Freddy Fazbear is, of course, the main animatronic of the group and the head mascot of the family-friendly Freddy Fazbear's Pizza restaurant. He has a top hat and bow tie on and has gone on to be the face of the entire franchise, both IRL and in the in-game universe. Next up is Bonnie. He's a purple bunny with a red bow tie, and very rarely when you open the game up, his face will appear with an eyeless blank stare as the game loads, and is very unsettling to look at. Chica is a yellow chicken that has an obsession with food, and Foxy is a pirate-themed fox character that looks to be more beaten up and disheveled than the other 3 animatronics for whatever reason. These 4 animatronics right here are definitely creepy to look at even without the context of them trying to kill you. Not to mention, when you check the camera, some really creepy scenes can happen, like when you check the main 3 camera and see them all staring back at you, or how when Freddy starts to roam around the restaurant, you can barely see him in the cameras and have to use the faint glow of his eyes to keep track of him. Even playing it now still creeps me the hell out. Also, there's a 5th secret animatronic called Golden Freddy. He appears rarely throughout the game and can be summoned by opening up the camera in the west hall corner. If the poster has his face on it and you close the camera, he will appear in the security room and start to glitch the game out before jump scaring you and ending your run. My personal favorite is the one where Chica stares down right at you in the middle of the dining room. I remember first playing the game, seeing that, and immediately got chills down my spine, and that's when I realized that this game was unlike any other, and that moment has stuck with me for 8 years and is a testament to how good the game's atmosphere is. Not to mention the lore that was hinted at in the game and the future titles, catching up on it was interesting, albeit very convoluted and messy, but still interesting nonetheless. I'll be doing a disservice trying to explain it all, but to sum it up as quickly as I possibly can, Purple Man bad. Now I can go on and on and on about how good the game is and how the sequels are and how the lore is and such, but the influence that this game had on the whole horror games for kids concept is undeniable. The walking simulator was dead, the creepypasta kids had grown up and moved on in life, and here comes the literal standing simulator building upon the horror games for kids concept that Slender brought forth, bringing in a breath of much needed fresh air to indie horror games in general. Five Nights at Freddy's taps into the childhood uncanniness that is Chuck E. Cheese animatronics, ramps it up to 11 on the creepy scale, and adds hints of lore to keep people interested beyond just the atmosphere and gameplay. It took everything that made Slender so popular and improved the formula along the way, adding and subtracting whatever was needed to make the game work. Five Nights at Freddy's couldn't be any more perfect on how to make a horror game without copious amounts of blood and gore, but with the foreboding atmosphere carried by uncanny imagery, the inability to avoid your tormentors, and again, those 4 damn animatronics. The horror games for kids concept had officially been recognized by many soon after the game came out, and the next evolution in the process was just around the corner. The fandom that this game has grown is nothing short of astonishing, far beyond what the creepypasta fandom did with Slenderman. Of course though, this wouldn't be possible were it not for the Let's Players jumping on the opportunity to give a new video game a shot, and boy did that help with the game's insane growth. There were countless Let's Plays of Five Nights at Freddy's back when it came out, literally thousands of videos of people trying out the brand new, super hyped game that everybody was talking about. It literally made people's entire careers on the internet. I can spend 10 plus minutes trying to name all the notable YouTubers of back then and today that made videos on this game. It was exactly like how Slender blew up, only on a much larger scale now as Let's Players and YouTube in general were getting more and more popular. Markiplier, of course, while already a massively successful YouTuber even before the game came out, made his own Let's Play video, and well, the view count is more than enough to tell you just how good of an idea that was and how influential the game series is. Some say if it wasn't for the videos like Markiplier's or others that the game wouldn't be nearly as popular, and others say it would have taken some more time but still would have persevered. While we can never know that answer for certain, one thing is for sure. Five Nights at Freddy's was the first of this now solidified genre of horror games for kids to hit massive mainstream popularity, all with the help of Let's Players jumping on the opportunity to play a brand new video game for their audience to enjoy. Now with the release and the subsequent explosion of Five Nights at Freddy's, YouTubers did what they do best, and that's hop on a trend for views, subscribers, and that sweet green stuff needed to survive on Earth. Most people did Let's Plays, while others took their own approach and decided to flesh out the lore from within the game, so to speak. Yeah, I'm talking about game theory, cause if it wasn't for MatPat and the rest of his crew, a vital piece of what currently makes horror games for kids work wouldn't even exist, and you'll see why shortly. So, to sum up game theory, MatPat goes over the lore in a video game and gives his own theory on it. Before FNAF, he would go over general popular video games at the time and easy to talk about games too, stuff like Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda, all with a concise script and snappy editing to boot. This series had already made its mark way before FNAF came out, but his first and subsequent videos going over the lore in the game set the table for what's to come. The videos themselves are entertaining to watch even years later, but there is one thing I'd like to point out and something that falls in line with how this channel and Let's Players operate. The power of influence and the free publicity that comes with it. We already saw how it was in the early days with Slender, but with FNAF things were ramped up to a whole nother level. Now game theory on the surface started off as just that, but something that game developers noticed alongside the Let's Players playing FNAF and promoting it to their audience for free, the same thing is happening with game theory, only this time instead of just playing the game, they take a dive into the hidden story, so to speak, giving the game more publicity and people more intrigue to keep up with the franchise. I don't think that this was anything people could predict happening, but it certainly became a reality. Let's Players play the game gets popular, game theory makes a video going over the deeper lore, game gets even more popular, and this is 100% free advertising that the game developers don't have to pay a single cent for. All they have to do is get their game noticed by the right people, and theoretically the money should start pouring in. It worked with FNAF, and we all know how that game series is going, so of course it can work with another gaming franchise. Now finally, this is the time where horror games for kids started to really take shape. It all started with Slender making a rough formula, and then after seeing the success behind Five Nights at Freddy's, other game developers started to take a look at what made it so popular for people despite being so simple in design that a 12-year-old could make it. These things were the animatronic characters that, while creepy and unsettling to look at, are memorable and could easily be portrayed in a cute and harmless way. The rather unique take on horror at the time relied more on atmosphere than blood and gore, and the underlying story and lore that kept people wanting more and more. These factors is what made the horror games for kids formula finally take its perfect shape. Now, as the rest of 2014 progressed into 2015 and going to the end of that year, the FNAF franchise was only growing and growing. Scott Cawthon released Five Nights at Freddy's 2, 3, and 4 within a few months of each other. Let's Players of course would play these new releases as the months went on, and MatPat would turn game theory into FNAF theory for a moment in time to keep that sweet YouTube ad revenue rolling in. Then the FNAF merch started to make its way to everybody's faces. There was so much FNAF merch all over the place in 2015 and 16. I remember at my local Walmart, the kids section was filled with all sorts of cheap stuff, ranging from toys to clothes, and of course that FNAF slime that is still being made with the current Security Breach characters for God knows what reason. It was making bank though, cause there was always new stuff being added whenever I would end up at that part of the store. The fandom was going extremely strong. The amount of fan art that was being made by people was nothing short of insane, some cute, some more risque, but this is the internet we're talking about, and you know what they say? Any publicity is good publicity. Fan games are being made like Five Nights at Candy's, and in fact, there are still fan games being made up to this very day after Scott started his Fazbear Fanverse initiative, like with the upcoming Five Nights at Freddy's Plus. The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise is the prime example of solidifying the new horror games for kids market, but unfortunately seems to be the only one to have done it right so far, as some games that have come out after trying to copy the success have either been failures straight from the beginning or dropped the ball after a strong start. Game developers saw the success of FNAF and what factors made it such a popular franchise in such a short time. Those things were a horror atmosphere not reliant on blood and gore, simple yet engaging gameplay, the Let's Players playing the game to their millions of fans, characters that are appealing to the eye while still unsettling to look at, the interesting lore to keep people coming back for more, and the social media presence from people in the fandom, keeping the games on people's minds, all while promoting the franchise for free, just like with the Let's Players in game theory. Of course, there would be other games that would take a similar approach, only this time instead of growing into a massive multimedia franchise, they would come out the gates with a sprint before taking a nasty tumble straight to the pavement below. Hello Neighbor is a game developed by Dynamic Pixels and published by TinyBuild. Both companies were relatively unknown before the game was announced, with Dynamic Pixels only known for making iOS and Android games, and TinyBuild publishing said games. Sometime in 2014, Dynamic Pixels would take their first steps into the console market and start development on Hello Neighbor, and throughout the years they would polish things up, adding proper animations and textures and whatnot, and on October 26, 2016, they would release their Alpha 1 build of the game, giving people a sneak peek of what was to come in the finalized product. The gameplay was simple but both fun to play and watch. Basically, you had to sneak into the neighbor's house after becoming suspicious of him, with the teases in the future pointing towards a much more sinister secret than initially anticipated. The Alpha 1 build was an instant hit among the horror games for kids crowd, and Let's Players would jump on top of the hype to get their views and money and promote the game more. I remember seeing the build and thinking, while it's not my cup of tea, it certainly looked to be an interesting game that held a lot of promise. Now I can go into much more detail on what exactly led the game down its eventual path, but to make things as concise as I can for you guys, as each alpha build and eventual beta builds would come out, the game became more and more convoluted, with the simple house with a dark secret now a sprawling mansion of sorts, with twists and turns at every corner, and landscapes that certainly don't fit the American suburban vibe the first alpha build put together. Hello Neighbor would fully release on December 8th, 2017, and the game, once seen as a fun, mysterious blend of light horror with childlike elements, became, to put it frank, a giant mess of broken platforming and lore ham-fisted so hard into people's faces, yet making little to no sense whatsoever. Like I said, it was a mess and a very disappointing one at that. The game had promise from its first alpha build, but along the lines it became more and more obsessed with adding lore and quite literally expanding the scope of the neighbor's house. It became a janky, unfun mess by release. What made this failure so interesting was not just the massive shift in presentation and gameplay, but the clear emphasis on lore and world building over substance. Now tell me, what other franchise at the time was known for its lore and world building? That's right, the FNAF franchise. And that franchise, with its lore and world building, made it a lot of money. And the ever-expanding merch only helped it make even more money and get even more popular and successful. I remember when Hello Neighbor fully came out, I was putting the pieces together in my head, trying to see what exactly went wrong and how they could screw up such a great start to their franchise, and that's when I came across this book right here on Google. A book made to clearly build upon the game's world and lore, and that's when it hit me. The game was being sent down the FNAF route of success, only this time instead of it being natural growth, it was forced to become something it wasn't, and in doing so ruined the end product. It wasn't a case of too many cooks in the kitchen, but rather a case of putting the wrong ingredients in the pot. You can make a great game by adding the right things to the base mechanics, but once you start adding too much and try to force it to everybody's gaming taste, it becomes a mess of too many conflicting ideas and the overall product is ruined. That's what happened here with Hello Neighbor. The game started off as its fun little thing, but the developer and publisher saw how the game grew through the new advances in the horror games for kids market and wanted a piece of that pie, so they tried to copy the formula in their own way and failed. The funny thing is that Let's Players started to drop the game, with Markiplier not playing it ever again after the July 25th, 2017 beta release, and even Game Theory not touching the game since August 29th, 2017. It was clear that the game had lost their interest with the constant major changes, and people saw that forcing a game to become popular by copying what made another game popular simply couldn't work out, and in doing so could ruin the game entirely. Now, the Hello Neighbor franchise is still going steady, albeit not nearly as popular as its initial alpha showcase, but it hasn't faltered yet. Hello Neighbor Hide and Seek will come out December 7th, 2018, a prequel going over why the neighbor became such a recluse in the first place, and Secret Neighbor will come out October 24th, 2019, a multiplayer spin-off where you and your friends have to get into the neighbor's basement, but one of your friends is the neighbor in disguise and must stop everyone else. It's a very strange game that, while isn't necessarily bad, it does make you wonder why the developers decided to jump onto a whole nother genre of video gaming to begin with. On April 17th, 2020, a Hello Neighbor animated short would release, teasing people for a potential animated series. The only reason I even know this exists is because of this classic image right here, so good job on whoever was running PR that day. At least people remember the show in the first place, albeit not in the way they intended. I also found out while making this video that there is a game called Hello Engineer that was released exclusively for Google Stadia on October 26, 2021, which is a sort of multiplayer machine building type game where you and your friends build cars to travel throughout the world. Sudden genre shifts aside, Hello Neighbor 2 is in development currently and is scheduled to release December 6, 2022. It is looking to be a promising children's horror title and not the giant mess the first was, but until now we just have to wait and see what the full release has to offer. Hello Neighbor is an example of how not to use the FNAF formula for success, because despite its early promise, people don't want to support a game that doesn't follow up on said promise and instead decides to brute force its way into popularity, all while almost killing the franchise entirely. It's clear that Dynamic Pixels and Tiny Build got lost in the sauce and so are trying to get their bearings together in order to make a sequel deliver on its initial promise, a fun children's horror game. The fact the franchise is still around is a miracle in of itself, because despite the constant genre shifts in their games after the failure of the first, they still have the money and support for the sequel. If the sequel fails, however, there is no doubt the franchise will die and become yet another relic of the past. Now, the FNAF formula is still something sought after by many game developers, because despite the clear example of natural progression needed to meld everything together in order to make it work, the potential money is just too much for people to pass up on, and so seeing where Hello Neighbor failed, a brand new gaming studio took notes and put together their own title for people to play. A title that has made a name for itself, albeit not the kind of name that they want to be known for. I'm sure most of y'all watching this have heard of Poppy Playtime, a game that has quite a reputation to put it lightly. The game is developed by Mob Games, which is headed by Isaac Christopherson. The people overseeing Mob Games is Enchantedmob, a YouTube channel that animates the most popular children's figures in gaming and mixes them into pop culture whenever possible, like with their Squid Game animation. The animations are surprisingly very well done and don't give off a cash grab type of vibe like with those old Elsa Spider-Man videos from way back a few years ago. However, if you dig a little deeper, you can see that Enchantedmob likes to promote their videos in a very strange way. Enchantedmob owns plenty of other YouTube channels, namely Zamination. You know what kind of videos they post on that channel? The same exact videos on Enchantedmob, and when I mean the same exact videos, I mean literally uploading the same video twice on two different channels, the only difference being in the thumbnails. As you can already tell, these guys at Enchantedmob are clearly in the YouTube game to maximize their profits, even if it means using some shady business practices along the way, practices that we'll get into later on in the video. Throughout all the years in making videos, Enchantedmob got the idea to dip their toes into the gaming sphere that made their channel so popular to begin with. Isaac Christopherson would become the head of Mob Games, and they would start development on Poppy Playtime in June and would soon release a trailer to the game on September 1st, 2021. The game was looking to be yet another children's horror game, and it has similarities to the original FNAF trailer, showing gameplay to give people the idea of what formula it's trying to take inspiration from. The game would release in chapter form, and so on October 12th, 2021, Chapter 1 would be released to positive reception, with reviewers praising the atmosphere and overall design, particularly of the monster hunting you down, Huggy Wuggy, while criticizing its short runtime at under an hour despite costing $5 to buy. Despite that, the game's future was looking to be a good one. It's clear it's trying to copy the same success as FNAF right from the very start, with a tense horror atmosphere and memorable characters chasing the player down, but unlike Hello Neighbor, didn't look to be forcing things to work, and instead was waiting for the natural progression to kick in into becoming the next big children's horror game. However, very soon after the release of Chapter 1, the game would suddenly be mired in controversy and become known for far more than just being another potential gaming franchise. On October 16th, only 4 days after the game's release, someone by the name of Ekra Coaster would put out a Twitter thread accusing the developers of Poppy Playtime for plagiarizing his own game Venge. While it's hard to prove the plagiarism claims, Coaster would go into more detail on his experience with the people behind Enchantedmob, and soon things started to feel like more than just two games with similar approaches. Now, there is a lot to go over, and the stuff that goes down from Coaster's perspective really gives you an idea on how Enchantedmob likes to work behind the scenes. Things start with the manager of Enchantedmob messaging Coaster, who was a 15-year-old at the time, a few years ago on Discord to try and get him to join another channel they own called 3A Display. Coaster declined but wanted to be in contact with the manager as he still looked up to these people, and having a connection to them was great for networking. Enchantedmob didn't feel the same, and some of them would start to talk shit about Coaster behind his back. He would catch wind of this, and soon his relationship with them would slowly fall apart. First by them using his outro music in their own video and trying to claim that it was him copying them, and then in a much more nefarious way. Animation Sins was a channel that did the whole Sins video genre thing, basically small nitpicks on whatever the topic is in a jestful manner, both being humorous while also giving small advice in the process. Animation Sins, of course, would focus on animations, but instead of punching up at bigger studios like Disney or Paramount, some of their videos would harshly punch down at Coaster himself, mind you, after they had already been shit-talking him beforehand. Coaster didn't like this and asked them to stop, but instead of stopping, he would get into an argument about fair use and how Enchantedmob can do whatever they want as the video falls under fair use. Basically them trying to justify bullying a 15-year-old for no reason other than because they don't like him. Hell, at one point it even came out that they didn't like how Coaster was making FNAF animation videos similar to theirs, and the manager himself even said Coaster was trash, and when confronted about it, he immediately tried to shift the conversation at hand. Needless to say, it became clear to Coaster that this group of people didn't like him and were using any opportunity they could to bully him, a 15-year-old mind you, that was a fan of them and inspired by them to become a better animator because of their skills. So, when it came to Coaster working on Venge and seeing Poppy Playtime come out with a very similar style to his game, while it doesn't seem like plagiarism in of itself, it does seem like yet another attempt from the Enchantedmob people and other bad apples to again take more shots at Coaster. Suddenly, the idea of Poppy Playtime being a little similar to Venge doesn't seem like that now that we know about the bad blood going on between them, and I implore you to read the full Twitter thread Coaster posted when you get the chance to get a real idea of what's going on and how exactly Enchantedmob works behind the scenes. In the forefront, however, Enchantedmob was reveling in the success of their first game from their new gaming studio, but public opinion would suddenly shift on them. On December 2nd, 2021, Mob Games' official Twitter account would announce the launch of Poppy Playtime NFTs and hinted that they would link to clues about the upcoming Chapter 2, effectively selling game lore in a very, very bad way. I don't need to tell you guys about NFTs and why they're so bad and hated by people, so to see the developers of the game jumping right into them when they only had an hour of a game released to the public was shocking to say at the very least. The backlash was instant and the tweet was deleted soon after, but the damage had already been done. Soon the link to their store from the game's title screen and the constant merch and collaborations with other companies such as U2's didn't feel like a game that had a great start, but rather one that exists simply for one reason and one reason only: cash grab. Poppy Playtime wasn't a video game made by a talented studio with the backing of Enchantedmob, but rather Enchantedmob trying to cash grab in their own unique way, by making a game that on the surface looks to be great, but behind the scenes is nothing more than another cash grab, and one that seems to stem from a purely financial standpoint and nothing more. Also, remember Isaac from earlier? Ever wonder how he got dragged into the mess that is Enchantedmob? Well, it turns out that they came to him and another content creator named Faint Turnip after a video they made together blew up, and they would sign a contract, with their parents' permissions of course, to create a new channel called 3A Display, that very channel that Enchantedmob invited Coaster on before he turned them down. The kicker here is that Isaac, Faint Turnip, and Enchantedmob will get a third of the channel's revenue, but only Isaac and Faint Turnip were the ones who worked on it, meaning that Enchantedmob was getting money for doing literally nothing at all, except exploiting the work of children of course. Faint Turnip would dip and escape somehow, and Isaac would stay around, and from what I can gather isn't one of the bad apples behind the scenes, but rather someone who genuinely wants to make the best product he can. It's just that Enchantedmob is getting in the way and running things to the ground with their greedy practices. Things would only get worse for Enchantedmob from here on out, and this time it's much worse than just making fun of Coaster and bullying him in their videos. On April 29th, 2022, it would come out that some of Enchantedmob had made a deep-fried meme sometime in 2018 of Coaster's avatar doing some very nasty things to FNAF character Circus Baby. According to FNAF lore, Circus Baby is an animatronic possessed by the spirit of antagonist William Afton's young daughter. So here we have Coaster, who was a minor at the time, animated in an explicit position with the child character, and during this time frame was being shit-talked behind the scenes by the bad apples at Enchantedmob. Bad apples that include the two people that own Enchantedmob to begin with, Zach and his brother Seth. As you guys can tell, this is not a good look for Enchantedmob whatsoever, and soon things would finally boil over in an official response from them. On May 3rd, Zach would make a Twitter post going over the recent controversy surrounding Poppy Playtime and its entire existence to begin with. He states they never intended to hide any lore behind the NFTs and that it was just them jumping the gun when it came to growing the brand. He states that all the money they got from the NFTs will go to the Clean Air Task Force, an organization that focuses on decreasing air pollution and promotes clean energy. The next part goes over their side of the Coaster story, saying that he refused to contact them after taking their videos down on him and that they dropped the Animation Sins channel entirely afterwards because of the situation with him. He goes on and says that when the initial accusations came out in October that it was absurd Coaster thought they were trying to spite him once more, that it was nothing at all and that they tried to reach out to him but he never responded. Zach gives a PR apology to both Coaster and the readers and leaves things at that, saying they hope the future looks better now that they explain their side of the story. The next day on May 4th, Seth would come out with his own post going over the deep-fried meme of Coaster and Circus Baby together. He would state that this was nothing more than shit posting and that there were no ill intentions involving the one with Coaster whatsoever, despite all the evidence pointing towards so. He again tries to convince people that there were no sexual intents behind the meme, but it's pretty obvious to everyone that there is, but I digress, so let's move on. The final part goes over the bad working condition rumors that have been going around, not naming anything in particular, but saying that it's nothing going on, that it was just Zach and Seth trying to learn how to run a proper business now that everything is getting off the ground. Now, it's very clear that these are the most PR responses a response can be, and they're only doing this now because of a recent video released on April 29th by Theft King getting massive views, otherwise they wouldn't have bothered to speak about things and kept ignoring the issue like they've been doing. It's clear to everyone that Zach, Seth, and the other bad apples running Enchantedmob clearly had a thing against Coaster, and from what we can tell, only stemmed from him turning down their offer to join 3A Display and not getting his money taken from them like how it was with Isaac and Faint Turnip. Poppy Playtime is a very interesting case to go over, because on the surface it seems like a game destined to finally match up to FNAF and become the next big horror game for kids. Everything on the surface perfectly falls into place, but the issues plaguing it are holding it back substantially. What's funny is that the issues aren't from the development team as far as we can tell, but Enchantedmob themselves. Their greediness, shady past, and shady business practices are holding this game back from becoming the next FNAF, and is instead heading down an even worse route than Hello Neighbor. While Hello Neighbor was a failure in its own right, it wasn't failed by awful behind the scenes practices, but rather getting lost in the sauce and the development team biting off more than they could chew. I can respect a bad game made by a passionate team who only wanted to make the best game they could, but I can't respect a game overseen by a group of people who are clearly in the business for the money only, starting from re-uploading their content onto other channels to releasing NFTs of their own game. Their past with Coaster only solidifies the idea that they only have their best intentions in mind and will bully whoever they want in order to feel better about themselves. It makes me wonder if Isaac took the opportunity to head the development of the game in order to try and distance himself from Enchantedmob as much as he can, but that's purely me speculating, so who knows what went on there. In fact, Poppy Playtime already seems to be off to a bad new foot, as with the release of Chapter 2 on May 5th, 2022, they are now charging $10 for it while making Chapter 1 free to play to try and quell the crowd, again showing everyone that this is all a money thing to Enchantedmob and nothing more. Anybody that bought Chapter 1 for $5 now has to pay $10 for Chapter 2, making it a total of $15 for a game that hasn't even been fully released. Anybody now buying the game only has to pay $10 for both Chapter 1 and 2. It really makes you feel cared for by Enchantedmob. They are definitely not trying to make as much money as they possibly can off of everybody. It's not like they have a history of doing that. I do wish for the game to have a successful future, I really do, but it's clear by this point Enchantedmob are not the right people to support this game. Shady practices like re-uploading content on multiple channels for maximum profit may work on YouTube, but with video games, people need to buy and not just watch the game in order for it to be successful, and unfortunately for them, people don't want to support Enchantedmob no more after their dirt was finally dug up for people to see. The ever-growing problem of horror games for kids isn't the abundance of bad ripoff games or games failing after showing promise, but when highly skilled and smart people take advantage of a children's market that until recently hadn't been affected by greedy practices on a scale like this. Enchantedmob are smart. They've been using the same greedy formula on YouTube for years now, signing kids to awful contracts, re-uploading content on multiple channels, and now things are finally crashing down on them as people have learned that they aren't in the video game business out of passion, but are in it purely for the money. Unfortunately for them, they underestimated people when releasing those NFTs back in December, and their past of harassing Coaster has finally come back to haunt them. If Poppy Playtime fails, there's no doubt they'll just keep focusing on their YouTube channels, and as a matter of fact, will probably keep growing as the children watching those videos won't be old enough to understand the current situation, but people will always know of their true nature now, and if you ask me, that's already one big step in the right direction. The social presence of the game seems to be slowly dwindling away even after the release of Chapter 2, as while review-wise it wasn't as well received as Chapter 1, it's clear that people are now seeing the game in a much different light. I didn't talk about the Let's Players for this part because they're still playing the game and making their respective videos, as it's clear the controversy hasn't affected their channels just yet. Only time will tell if those Let's Players are forced into dropping the game as the controversy surrounding it grows, so we'll just have to wait and see on that. Zach even appeared on an interview with Theft King, and yet there was barely anything interview related in the video. It just felt like a PR stunt to try and quell the crowds yet again, and in my opinion, a pretty bad one at that. The whole video is basically a history lesson sob story about the company's initial creation and how oh so hard it was, yet doesn't go over the messages sent to Coaster, or the animation sins videos made on them, or how they re-upload content on multiple channels, or on the picture they made of Coaster and Circus Baby together. It's just a poor attempt to use a feel-good story to try and get people to lower their pitchforks. Unfortunately for them, me and many others saw right through this. So, here we are currently, a war in the comments on a disingenuous so-called interview, an interview that Zach didn't even speak in and only participated in through Discord text once the public backlash finally caught up to them after months of building up. I originally planned on a video solely dedicated to Poppy Playtime and its development, but its very existence is so interesting to me. To see a game that has copied a formula started all the way back when Slender came out, then perfected by FNAF, only to twist and mangle it up with their greedy practices, I knew I had more to say than I originally expected. Poppy Playtime looks good, it has a great atmosphere, but everything about it screams a cash grab when all the pieces are put together. What makes it more interesting is that this isn't some low-effort cash grab like the Elsa's Spider-Man videos I mentioned earlier, but an extremely high-effort one headed by someone who was essentially coerced into the company through shady business tactics. The bad guys here aren't Coaster or Faint Turnip or even Isaac, but Enchantedmob, because now that people are starting to see the game's existence for what it truly is, you can't help but get a bad taste in your mouth for what's to come. It's quite poetic to see that Enchantedmob's success came from making high-effort animations on clickable video games to bring in as much views and money as possible. Yet when using that same formula in their own game, they fumble the bag almost immediately by letting that same greediness ruin what is otherwise a promising franchise headed by the wrong people.